no one wants to hear me talk for 10 minutes, like on the floor. They want to train. So why, hey, 2 to 3 minute explanation. I'll show, hey, how you don't do it, or or I'll have a player show them how you shouldn't do it. And then they're all like, no, it's not like that. Like, here are the cues. And it's a lot of questions by the coaching staff. Like, hey, what are we looking for here? Because I want them to own, and that makes me understand if I'm lecturing and a kid's sitting in the back of the room, like gazing, it's not going to stick with him. And then you're going to have a bad rep in the following block. So understanding, hey, it's a lot of questions, and understanding that they own and actually truly do understand it.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one fitness and performance resource in Switzerland. Today, I'll be chatting with Mike Tucker, strength and conditioning coach for Villanova football. Mike is a strength and conditioning coach with experience coaching high school, collegiate, and professional athletes of all major sports. He's made previous stops at San Jose State, Clemson, Kutztown, North Dakota State, and Holy Cross. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Sean, appreciate you having me. I think it's an honor. You've had a lot of good guests, so I'm fired up to have a good conversation with you.
No, likewise, man. So let's get started. How did you get into coaching in the first place?
Yeah, I think it stems from me being an average athlete and utilizing the weight room and some really good relationships that I had with my high school and college coaches, and then seeing success on the field, whatever little I had of it. But allowing those relationships that I had with my high school coaches as well as my college strength coach, Jeff Oliver, ultimately got me really interested in it. And then I was able to intern under my college strength coach every summer while training with the football team. So I'd train with the football team for a couple hours, and then I'd work the rest of the day. So I definitely got a lot of coaching reps in at an early age, which was a really good experience.
Besides the couple people you mentioned in your past that kind of put you in the coaching realm, who has been your biggest influences in the field once you got started in coaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll dive into this a little bit from a philosophical standpoint. I think like James Smith, Charlie Francis are like my big influences.
Cool.
From that regard. But when we look at, the places I've been or the people that I've talked to, I think you take something from everybody. And some places that I've been, it's like, hey, I know I don't want to do that, or I don't want to act like that, which is just as important, right? As, having mentors that show you how to do things, or, the right way to go about doing things. I think it's as important to see and experience things. It's like, okay, I know that I can't act like that, or I know that I don't want to be like that. So I think you take pieces from everybody, and that experience that you culminate is who you become.
Without necessarily citing any names, could you recall a few of those points that you saw in the industry or other people do or say, and you told yourself, I'm never doing that, or this is not who I want to be?
Yeah. I think we'll keep that in house, but yeah, 100%. There's I think if you look around social media or on television, you see a depiction of a strength coach in a certain light, and I think we're trying to change how that perception. So it starts with action from everybody.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like asking my guests, what did you change your mind about since you started coaching? We all come into the profession with our own, belief system and our previous experiences, and we often get kind of humbled by the work that we do, and we realize pretty quickly that we don't know everything. So what are some of the major things that you changed course on over the course of your coaching career?
Yeah, I think the term that you just used is really relevant, humbled, because I feel like, every time I talk to somebody new, I feel dumber, and I feel like inadequate. So I'm always constantly trying to learn and talk to as many people as possible. And that's what social media is great about, is, us connecting and just being able to talk to different people and gather new ideas and information. One person that comes to mind is Andy Ryland. I know you know all his stuff, like the prep for contact stuff. I thought we were doing enough. And then every conversation with that guy, I'm like, okay, we got to alter this or change that. That was definitely one. And then early on in my career, it was very weight room oriented. I think the first, 1 to 2 years, it was very weight room oriented. And then the high speed running exposure from one of my mentors, Mike Nicolini at the Niners, that was, influential in, the last, 6-7 years in my career. So that's kind of like what really altered my view in training athletes early on. And then kind of more recently during quarantine, definitely just talking to Andy, maybe once a week, once every other week has definitely shaped my opinion on that stuff.
No, I think he's been instrumental for me, just like you, in better understanding the demands of, especially for the upper body in terms of football and rugby. I mean, it's a little bit different, but still fairly similar. And how to integrate that with the guys in a way that's going to be beneficial for them is really important now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hit it on the head. I think us moving away from the prep for collision mile. I'm not sure how it is in Switzerland with rugby, but in American football, it's 2 days of helmets, 2 days of, upper shells, pads, and then full contact, on practice 5. So that's a pretty big spike in acute workload and collisions. So trying to space that out and span it, you can't replicate that full speed collision, but you can do a lot of prep for contact in those months prior.
Yeah, we didn't have much of a structure before in terms of progressing that. I never thought about it that far. I did include a very little bit of wrestling last year, but there was no like step-by-step approach. There was no progression. It was like, oh, those exercises look cool. I mean, I think I start like this with a lot of things where I'll see something and I'm like, okay, I don't fully understand this, but I know it has to be part of my program in one way or another. So I'm going to start playing with it, knowing full well I don't have all the cards in hand yet, but then slowly learning more about it and then slowly learning how to structure it, how to progress it, all these things.
Yeah, and I think if you wait until you, quote unquote, think you really mastered it, I think you're too late. So I think that experiential learning that you're kind of involved in, I think that's exactly how we do it here. It's very, okay, we'll try it on ourselves. How do we feel? What do we think the progressions are? We're reaching out to different coaches, trying to piece together whatever element it is. Right now we're talking about return to prep for contact, right? And trying to experiment with it. How do the guys feel? Open to conversations like that. So I think you hit it on the head there.
Yeah, one thing we talked about off air before the podcast was microdosing and how that's one of the central pieces of what you do, or at least how you apply what you know with your guys due to time constraints, et cetera, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit for those who are not familiar with the concept? What is microdosing?
Yeah. So so myself and Sean Doherty, he's the director of lacrosse at Villanova. We kind of implemented it with a number of teams. And so it stemmed from time constraint or practice schedule constraint, like a lot of people, right? So if we think of a spring ball for American football, maybe it's Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday practice. And traditionally that means your lifts will be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So if you're thinking of Bush-Exnator, like neural versus general day, or the Charlie Francis high-low model, every day is high or every day is a neural day, right? So trying to make it a more wave, we've just put all the high CNS neural lifts on those practice days and all the low CNS restorative lifts on the meeting only days or the recovery days.
Mm-hmm.
So now you have 6 days a week, 6 days per week of lifting, and it's a more high-low wave model. So we're actually recovering on those in between practices. So going back to the older model, if you were to practice Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, but Wednesday and Friday, you have deadlifts, hang cleans, back squat, rear foot elevated, right? So understanding that it's like, okay, what are we trying to get in spring ball? The most important thing is to practice the sport, right? Because if they're sore or they don't have any energy or any reserves to practice sport effectively and efficiently, then the learning process is altered. And ultimately, we're not training Olympic weightlifters or bodybuilders or powerlifters. We're training sport athletes, right? So that's kind of where it stemmed from, and that a lot of influence from Charlie Francis, from Derek Hansen, and then just experimenting too. Like Colin Mashton implements it with his teams at Villanova as well. So we're always trying to find the best way, whether quote unquote best, right? Every system's incomplete and flawed to an extent. So just us trying it on ourselves, trying it on our athletes, open conversations, and getting the sport coaches on board was a big part of that. Understanding, hey, we're trying to mitigate this stimulus or stress across the span of multiple days, right? We're not doing less work, right? So if you have 6 sets of bench and 6 sets of squat and 6 sets of TRX rows and 6 sets of kettlebell swings all on one day, like why can't you just take 2 of those exercises and bump them to another day, right? So now it's a little more restorative, it's a little more flush work, and will prime them better for that practice that following day. So it kind of stemmed from that. And then we've progressed, just like you mentioned earlier, we've progressed and developed and enhanced it each semester, each block that we do it with the team. Cause it's like, okay, we see something we don't like about it, or we see something we really like about it, and then we progress or take it out. So similar to, that experiential learning that we were talking about earlier, I think understanding that, hey, we don't have all the answers, but we've seen great success in injury rates and player readiness with it. So we're going to continue to progress and work with it.
Yeah, man, super interesting that combo of high-low structure plus the microdosing. I want to come back to the high-low structure later on in the chat, but I'd like can you go into more detail in terms of the practical implementation of microdosing itself, whether it's for speed, for strength, for power? How do you structure those sessions? How long are they? How long do they take? All those details for the coaches that might be interesting in actually using that, but haven't yet figured out how to do it.
Yeah, sure. So, and one byproduct that we really found and we didn't really expect is the guys really liked it. Like we were like, hey, we're going to do this. And the guys were kind of hesitant at first, but instead of having an hour and 10-minute lift where there's 3-4 blocks and you have to really hold their attention and you're really draining that reserve energy, right? It's 2 blocks, 25 minutes, right? We'd actually do it right after practice too. Mm-hmm. We're a morning practice team. So, we have breakfast, meetings, and then practice, 8 to 10. All right. And then they'll have post-practice nutrition, and then they're right in the weight room. We don't have to re-warm them up. We'll hit some form of quote unquote activation prior. So they're not just walking off the field, eating a snack, and then, heading into the rack or whatever. Mm-hmm. But we'll have some form of nutrition for them, and then we'll hit 1 or 2 blocks. Right. And that's kind of that neural high day for our guys. So it's only 25 or 30 minutes. And then the following day is the low CNS day where the guys are in meetings. So like when the offense is meeting, the defense lifts and vice versa. So having that structure, and it's a little more recovery based, it's a low CNS training session, but it's still, again, 30 minutes. So it's an extended warm up, 1 or 2 blocks. And those are by no means quote unquote easy days. I think coaches, when they hear neural or general, right? General, oh, that's easy. Right. And if you're structuring it properly and there's a goal in the adaptation behind it, I think that it's crucial to the development of the athlete to prime them up ready for the next day. And what's most beneficial, I think, about the microdosing model that we've kind of cultivated at Villanova with myself, Sean, and Colin, as well as the rest of the staff at Villanova, I think having that autonomy of hey, Sean comes in, and he says, yo, Coach Tuck, I don't feel great today. It's like, all right, we can alter a lot of different stuff because it's not that big a deal because we lifted yesterday and we're going to lift tomorrow. So it really gives the player, and I think you have to have a more mature team and have that trust in that relationship, but it really gives the guys autonomy over themselves and their development, which I think is important.
Yeah, like you said, you have to make sure that they're not going to fry themselves on a low day just because well, that would compromise the following days of training.
Exactly. Yep.
How do you make sure that is there always someone with them in the gym, I suppose, or how is it regimented so that they do stay on track and respect that kind of high-low or general and neural days?
Yeah. So when we explain it to the guys, we're not like, hey, today's a high CNS day or today's a neural day, right? It's like, hey, this is what's on the card for the day. And we'll go over the objective of the day, but we'll go over, we'll warm up or have that transition after practice. And then we'll go over the card, just that first block. I think coaches sometimes will go over the entire workout. Me personally, I can't remember the last block of a workout and the cues and the technique, let alone a 19-year-old. Right. When there's tempos involved and they're moving at a high pace, good luck, man. And we have some smart dudes at Villanova, much smarter than the athletes at Villanova are much smarter than me. But we go over 1 block at a time. We'll control the next 10 to 12 minutes and let's dominate the next 2 to 3 exercises, whatever they are. And then we'll bring it up post block 1, and then we'll get a drink and, go over block 2. And that way you're retaining everybody's attention span. You're enhancing the product they're actually doing. So they're not worried about block 2, block 3, block 4. You can't get to the 7th play of the drive if you don't get a first down, right? So I think it's important to understand, hey, the objective of block 1 and focus on that. So we segment the lifts like that in order to have the guys be pushed throughout and keep a pace and tempo about them.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I've tried to communicate better this year with the team and letting them know ahead of time what we're going to do for the session. But then, like you said, within the session, don't stand in front of them for 10 minutes at the start and then explain to them everything, because they'll turn around and be like, "What'd you say?" So
Yeah.
you might as well, like you said, just okay, what are we doing in the next 10 minutes, and then move on, explain the rest. And it's true that the guys respond a lot better to that.
Yeah, and let's be realistic. Like no one wants to hear me talk for 10 minutes like on the floor. They want to train. So why? Hey, 2 to 3 minute explanation. I'll show hey how you don't do it, or I'll have a player show them how you shouldn't do it, and then they're all like, no, it's not like that. Like here are the cues, and it's a lot of questions by the coaching staff. Like, hey, what are we looking for here? Because I want them to own, and that makes me understand if I'm lecturing and a kid's sitting in the back of the room like gazing, it's not going to stick with him, and then you're going to have a bad rep in the following block. So understanding, hey, it's a lot of questions, and understanding that they own and actually truly do understand it. Because I can say neural day or high CNS day, but if you can't replicate what I'm saying, it's irrelevant. So you're trying to bridge the gap between these textbooks and actual implementation with your guys, which I think is important.
Absolutely, I think it's crucial. Do you also use microdosing in your speed work, or do you have standalone sessions that are fairly substantial on that front?
So in season, and Sean Doherty, the director of lacrosse, probably has a little more experience with it in season than I do. So when we started cultivating it, we utilized it. Football utilized it in the off season. On our low CNS days, we'll hit 2 to 3 starts or 2 to 3 sets of explosive med balls, and that's kind of our quote unquote microdose, whether it's a speed emphasis or whether it's a power emphasis. So we'll always have some form of it in our training session. And it's just that volume that's fluctuating. So when you look at Charlie Francis vertical integration, like all things are present throughout the year and the intensity stays high, but it's the volume that really fluctuates. So, Sean has done a great job implementing that pre-practice with lacrosse in season. And he saw tremendous benefits and in that speed work in season. So our lacrosse team got faster in season. Now with football, when you're thinking like January, February is the really early off season, a lot of it is technical based because they just were at home for 5 weeks. They just played a full season. Then they were just at home for 5 weeks and probably didn't do as much as they should have. So, you're kind of knocking the rust off there, but it allows us to steal more adaptation in that regard, as long as the volume stays low on those low days. So that's kind of how we microdose it in our speed for our speed and power emphasis as well.
Something else I wanted to talk with you about today was agility versus change of direction. I know there's a lot of talk in the field about those two, and how one doesn't look like the other necessarily, or the mechanics of change of direction are not the same as the mechanics of agility. In a reactive environment, we have to process what you see and then make decisions and then orient yourself. So can you riff on those a little bit and give your point on what those two components are and then how they interact together in training?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head there with the mechanics. The mechanics would not be the same. I mean, you look at a guy running a 5.10.5 or pro agility, it looks nothing like him running a post route and then changing direction against a DB. I mean, it's night and day. So so when we look at early off season to late off season, obviously want to progress them and try and make that a seamless transition. So if we're working backwards from the sport, we're probably going to be a lot more agility dominant closer and closer to that season. And then as we progress back, we want to kind of lay the structural foundational tissue remodeling in that really early off season. We're probably going to do more change of direction. So I think it's a spectrum, and I think both have their merit within the program. And then you're just kind of shifting the emphasis from change of direction to agility as the off season goes on. You want to give those players more decision-making opportunities, more variable environments, more constraints-based learning, and less of the cone drills, the structured, right? And one of the things that I get really annoyed with is people putting their hands on the line for some reason, like when they're changing directions in COD. Like you'll never see that in a game. It alters their mechanics, right? Their torso needs to be going the opposite way. So why in the world are you actively trying to have them reach and turn? I just personally don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me. You never see it in sport. So that's definitely something that I don't really agree with. But I think change of direction and agility both have merit. It's just your implementation. If you're doing a ton of change of direction right before the season, I probably would disagree with that. So I think it's just the implementation and your progressions with it is the key.
I like the way you framed it, as in kind of start with change of direction and then move towards agility. I've heard a few people say that there is no transfer from one to the other. That if you train in a quote unquote closed environment, it will not transfer to let's say open environment agility work. What's your take on that?
I would say that no matter what physical qualities you develop, it's not going in that change direction closed environment. It's not going to transfer through that physiological mental process of the observe, orient, decide, act loop, right? It may allow you to, once you're getting in those positions, produce more output, but you still have to make those decisions. So if you're really incompetent at making those decisions at a rapid rate, it does not matter what your 5:10, 5:10, what your 5:10, 5 or pro agility time is, right? So I think understanding that structure and layout, like you can get physical outputs and adaptations with that COD, but now you have to apply it in a randomized, chaotic environment. So I think that's why it's important to have kind of that spectrum from a little more COD emphasis to a lot more agility emphasis as the off season progresses and continues. But that's a really good point by you.
Yeah, when you progress that from change of direction to agility as you move towards the season, what are some of the staple exercises or movement patterns that you like to rehearse and implement so that you can check all the boxes and make sure that the guys are going to be ready for the demands of the sport once they get on there?
Yeah, and no matter what sport we're talking, I know we're kind of focusing on rugby and American football here. No matter what sport we're talking about, it starts with the analysis of the sport, the breakdown of the sport, and then you're just working your way backwards. So
Mhm.
you're trying to replicate and understand the structures of the game as best as possible. So one of the things for like our skill guys, one of the things that closely resembles their practices, one, getting their position coaches out there, or two, having them do 7-on-7s, right? So like as we progress closer and closer to the season, that sport practice is the most sport specific thing they can do. And now how do we prepare them for that? A lot of open field decision-making tasks. So like a linebacker doing an open field tackling drill, right? They're not actually taking them to the ground. But the first time that they see an open field tackle drill and go through that loop shouldn't be the first week of August, right? We want to prepare them for that. Just like we talked about the prep for contact,
Right.
right? It shouldn't be that 5-day span in the first week of camp as their contact progression. So I think it's just putting them in variable exposed environments and making it random and repeated. You want them on the edge for learning, right? 10% outside their quote unquote comfort zone. Like that's where learning is enhanced the most. So when they are good at that basic drill, progress, right? And it's a bell curve. Everybody has the guys who are the outliers that no matter what you throw at them, they're elite at, and they're like, yo, coach, that was easy. Then you have the bulk of the team in the middle, and then you have the guys, no matter how rudimentary it is, they're going to struggle. So I think understanding your team and their specific needs, like your program shouldn't be the same from year to year. Your progression shouldn't be the same from year to year. And like me personally, I know we were talking about growth earlier. Like I want to look back in a year and be like, yo, what was I doing? Like, why is that in the card? Or I want to keep expanding. And the year that I look back and I'm like, oh, we're going to do 99% the same thing, I'm probably not developing at the rate I want to. And I probably have to make a change.
Yeah, maybe as a thought experiment, if we took last year, what you did last year in terms of change of direction agility, can you kind of talk us through how you framed it? What was your point of view going into it, and how now after a year, what you would change in that program?
Yeah,
Not
I'll take
necessarily
you through.
going into the specifics of the details, just the overall framework.
I'll take you through year one and year two at Villanova. I'm going on year three. So year
Mhm.
one, fundamental movement patterns for the previous regime. What fieldwork wasn't an emphasis. So we had to be very, very rudimentary early on and for a lot longer than I wanted to. So, when you draw out that periodization model and it's quote unquote perfect, right? That thing will be littered with red ink, right? That however long you program out, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, that thing will be littered with red ink, at least in my regard, because it's like, okay, we didn't progress fast enough, or they didn't look good enough to progress here. They looked really good there, so we can progress that. So we were very rudimentary, very slow cook, like a march, right? These dudes, their torsos are flailing all over the place. They didn't know like what dorsiflexion was. So
Right.
really had to very, very rudimentary teach. And then that second year, and then we did a lot less agility than I wanted because we were so slow cooking in the process,
Mhm.
because they couldn't hit the shapes that we wanted. They couldn't hit the rise levels that we wanted. They couldn't hit the patterns that we wanted. So, we were a lot more we held off a little on the agility stuff. I mean, we implemented it, but not nearly at the rate that we did year two. Year two, probably looked at the progression from a rudimentary change of direction or linear speed ACL max V model. And it's like, okay, well, let's see how they progress. And like week one, week two, I mean, they owned all the shapes, all the patterns, because they knew after a full, 12 months in the system that they knew what was going to be expected of them. They understood the base context, and speed isn't developed through those drills. Like you're not getting faster doing A marches, right? And you're getting faster through sprinting, and you're getting better at change direction through those open field agility drills. So we want to get to them as soon as possible. So as soon as they hit those prerequisites, or as soon as they are able to show that they can hit those shapes and patterns, we're moving on, right? I don't want to sit here and do an A march for 8 weeks. Like that's a waste of everybody's time. So we did a ton more. We progressed the COD a lot faster, a lot more agility based. And when we're agility based, we're essentially just looking to put them and expose them to these situations that they're going to be exposed to on the field, right? So we're looking at every force vector, every speed, every intensity, every angle, and how can we expose them to that in variable environment. So it's a lot of brainstorming on the whiteboard, to be honest with you, between the coaching staff.
What do you, when they're on the field and they're doing the agility work, what things are you looking at to determine whether what you picked as a progression or as an exercise is appropriate, or if maybe it's a little bit too advanced for the group or some of the players, and maybe you need to kind of put them back at the previous step so that they can master that before moving forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So understanding your prescription isn't always going to be perfect, and it's not going to be perfect for every guy. And I think some of the progressions I stole from Nick DeMarco at Elon is constraining one. When you look at constraints-based learning, you want to constrain the environment or the individual. So when we're looking at that environment, I want to constrain the space. So like small to big would be one example, right? A 10 by 10 to a 20 by 20, that 20 by 20 width and length of whatever box that you're doing an open field agility with, right? There's a lot more you're a lot more able to make decisions in that open space, right? It's a lot more space to cover. So we're going to go small to big. We're going to go a little number of participants to a larger number of participants. And then we're going to constrain what they're allowed to do. So say your star running back always does a spin move. And it's like, okay, I want to make it so you can't spin. So I'll just go up to him and be like, hey, you can't spin now. And then I might throw a little hesitation. Yo, coach, come on. It's like, no, man, like let's try and expose you to some other stuff. Yeah. Let's build some different skills. Yeah. So I think progressing it like that is one way. I think Nick has done a ton of work in the open field agility game with that stuff. So I definitely revert to him for a lot of it, to be honest with you.
Okay, cool. I like that. I mean, everything that you said kind of sits on the foundation that us as coaches are responsible for putting the right constraints on the exercise and the players so that we get the outcome that we're seeking. I don't necessarily see that with all coaches. Sometimes I see that, coaches getting angry because the guys are not doing what they're asked. Have you always had that mindset of, no, it's my job to actually frame it properly so that they do the right thing? And if the outcome is not the one that I wanted, then it's on me as a coach and I need to reframe it. Did you always have that in mind, or did you shift that along the way?
I think that's definitely culminated throughout my career. I think, you're exposed, what you're exposed to early on is what you're going to try and replicate. So as I've been exposed to different coaching styles and more research and more great coaches just having conversations with, I think that definitely progresses your attitude and mindset. And I think something you hit on the head was your team is a byproduct of what you focus on. So if you only focus on X and Y, don't expect Z. Like, it's your fault if you don't get Z. So I think what you mentioned there was really relevant. So we try and emphasize everything that's going to go into the game and transferability and specificity, right? And we lay the foundational groundwork. Like, that's great, but that's not going to transfer to the field. So how do we get these guys better as athletes? An offensive lineman needs to get in the way for 3.5 seconds, and he also needs to push somebody 5 yards. He does those two things really well, he's going to make $1 million, right? So understanding that, hey, I get him really good at those two things, he has a shot. So why is he running 300s? Why are they running gassers? I don't know. So no, I think you're right on there.
Shifting gears towards max velocity sprinting, That's been a topic that I've been really interested in for the last year, learning a lot from many different people. I know it's one of your specialties as well. Can you talk a little bit about your philosophy around sprinting and how you implement that with your teams?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call it a specialty, but it's something that
Areas of interest, maybe.
areas of interest. Yeah, let's do that. It's definitely an area of interest of mine. I think it transfers over to whatever sport immensely, right? You look at and say, oh, they don't run 50 yards straight ahead, max velocity. Well, if you're faster at 50, right, the research of Ken Clark shows that you're going to be faster at 20. So understanding that the max velocity affects the acceleration profile, I think is really important.
Mm.
And just really telling our guys that, because like when I first got there, the bigs, right, the 300-pound dudes, they're not doing the same volume and the same distances of the skill, but they're sprinting, and they've really hadn't been exposed to that prior. So that was definitely a mind shift for them.
Mm.
And you just explain it to them just like I just did, right? And understanding, hey, you're going to be quicker to the second level. You don't even have to go into the neural like benefits, but you can go into, hey, you're going to reach that 3-tech quicker. You're going to reach up to the second level a lot faster. So we generally split it a horizontal acceleration force dominant day, and then a vertical max velocity elastic dominant day.
Mm-hmm.
So those would be like both on the high CNS days. Those are all fresh. They're very able to have those high outputs. That's our goal of the day. So tons of rest and recovery, and sending that same signal from a physiological and technical standpoint, I think is really important. Like Stu McMillan talks about that a lot. And that's kind of where I stole that. I definitely defer to Altus. We talked about Bouchexnator, Altus, Ken Clark, like those are the guys I definitely defer to. So I think they're the experts, and I have an area of interest in it and trying to implement it effectively with the team setting. So you definitely got to look at, body types. You got to look at position demands, and then you kind of have to construct that ACEL or max V dominant day based on those two things.
Yeah, I'm always interested in hearing from other coaches. What kind of rest periods do you use, depending on whether it's an acceleration day if you're doing hills or sleds or something like that, and then your VMAX on the different distances if you're doing flies or stuff like that. What kind of rest times are we looking at?
I think a really good general rule of thumb is just 1 minute for every 10 yards. So if you're doing, a 20-yard build up and a 10-yard fly, that's 30 yards. So it's 3 minutes. And that gets coaches anxious sometimes, in constructing that environment where it's okay to rest, because we're after speed. If we're after repeat sprintability, which I don't really necessarily believe in, but if we're after repeat sprintability, like then they can be fatigued and huffing and puffing and all that stuff. But we're after true speed, like we want rest and recovery. So having that very general rule of thumb, like you just mentioned, is important, because what adaptation are we searching for, and then construct the environment based off that adaptation and the goal of the day.
I want to come back on what you just said about RSA, because I think it's a very interesting point. I've been looking into it a little bit recently, not only for, tried to put together a pyramid of the hierarchy of the tests, the physical tests that I would use for rugby, starting with the one that I would deem the most important, all the way to the one that I would do last if I had the time. And RSA ended up at the end of that list, because conditioning, top speed, explosiveness, strength, all those things would come before, and RSA just didn't really make sense. And then I don't know if you're familiar with Justin Kuhn, who just put out those power hours, right?
Yeah.
So he put the last one out on RSA, and essentially what came out of it, to really, really kind of water it down, is that if you're faster one time, you're going to be faster multiple times afterwards. So can you go a little bit deeper on that? I don't really believe in RSA. Is it one of those constructs that we've kind of put onto ourselves, and that at the end of the day doesn't really give us much to work with on the back end?
Yeah, and what I'll defer, and so Justin did an awesome job with the power hours. I've kind of read every single one and been talking to him about different ideas, but he did a great job there. And the way I look at it is this, and I think Derek Hansen kind of put that slide out maybe 10 years ago about the speed reserve, right? If you run a 10-900 and I run a 12-300, does it matter how in shape I am? Like, does it matter how many times I can repeat that effort? I'll never beat you, like, no matter, right? So understanding that construct is really important. And Justin showed that in his research. Like, hey, if you're significantly faster than somebody, you're going to continue to be significantly faster than them. It doesn't matter how many times they train repeat sprintability, no matter how many 300s or gassers they run, they're still slow. All right. And so the team that wins the championship isn't the team that's the most in shape. It's the team with the fastest, most explosive, strong, all the qualities you just mentioned. Right. So we set an aerobic base, and we do aerobic interval tempo runs and aerobic interval training to enhance that repeat sprint ability, right, and enhance the rate of recovery. But ultimately, we're trying to maximize those alactic outputs, right? Because you look at like the MVPs, all those guys, like Tyreek Hill is a top receiver in the NFL. It's not because he has great repeat sprint ability. It's because he's fast.
Right. Mm-hmm. Moving into what we talked about a little bit at the beginning of the discussion, the high-low model. So can you go a little bit deeper into that? And I'd like to hear about what those days look like on the high days, what those days look like on the low days. You went into it a little bit in terms of the strength work that you guys do, but then can you talk about all the other physical qualities that you guys try to cover, and then how that's spread out throughout the week?
Yeah, sure. So I will try not to be redundant here. But with that high-low model, right, the neural versus general, however you want to coin it, it is not hard versus easy. If you ask our guys, they probably think the high CNS days on the field are easier because those are the days that they get all the rest and recovery with the sprints. And then we're a tempo aerobic based on those low days. And so one thing I think that we've kind of constructed at Villanova is not having a linear tempo mindset. So maybe very early on in the off season, those tempos will be linear, but as we progress, we want to make them multi-directional so we can lay down the strains and the fascial lines and to construct tissue remodeling along similar lines that they're going to face in the field. And so if we do that in an extensive environment, we can also enhance the teaching, right? So you don't want to go 100 miles an hour on something that they've never done before initially. So we can enhance the teaching and learning environment if we show up and perform new tasks in those extensive low CNS environments that would be below 75% running speed and intensity. So we're essentially, that's kind of our low CNS field work. And then from a high CNS, from a low CNS weight room standpoint, you look at the motor unit recruitment chart, you look at axial loading, those are kind of two, and then speed of movement. Those are kind of three of the determinants that we look at when splitting those neural general days or those high low days. So by no means are the low days easy. And then that high CNS day we talked about was ACell max V, theme. And then we're going to carry those themes over into the weight room, right? So we're going to have a quad dominant push, maybe a trap bar deadlift on that ACell dominant day, that push force dominant day. And then the elastic dominant day is going to be a high output on the field. So we're going to marry it up with a high output in the weight room. So those are kind of fundamentally like that big umbrella. And then there's, you can implement a ton of different things within that structure, but just know that that's kind of the umbrella that holds it together.
When it comes to the field work, the agility work, do you have a preference whether it's done on the acceleration day or the max velocity day, or not necessarily?
It truly depends on like time, like things like time constraints and things like that. So when you look at, and say you're doing a 3 high day model where maybe it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday high, it's like one day can be a lot more agility emphasis, but I still want to expose them to that on those other days. So max velocity, since the distances are longer, you're generally going to have a longer rest period. So that's something to take into account, but you're also not going to have as many reps as an ACell dominant day. So it's really this interplay. And then as we get closer and closer to the season, it's like, okay, what becomes more relevant and more prominent? What do we have to get more of in, right? I need less A marches, A skips. I need less exposure to cone drills. I need more exposure to agility and more exposure to the demands of the sport. So it really depends on time of year and emphasis of that time of year.
In the preseason, so when the guys come back after a bit of a break, do you start right away with one Excel day and one VMAX day, or do you start with mostly acceleration work from just a safety standpoint?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because you don't know necessarily what they have done at home, right? You have to assume that they've done less than what you prescribed. So one way we get around that is on those max V days, we'll do light towing. So I think we've done a ton of readings and research with Jay Morin and Ken Clark, and just having discussions with those guys and understanding like, okay, what adaptation are we after? How are we going to get there? But if I strap a 20 or 40 pound resistance to you, maybe 10 or 15% speed decrement, right? I can expose you to those upright postures and your intent is still going to be maximal, but the intensity won't be. right? You're still not running that max effort speed. So I'm providing a constraint to your system that will slow you down, but the intent is there, the exposure is there. And so that's kind of what we'll emphasize more of after those long layoffs, right? Because now I don't want to say, okay, we're going to have two A cell dominant days. And we're going to do 10s and 15s, 10s and 15s, 10s and 15s, and then 15, 20, 15, 20. And it's like, okay, now we went 6 weeks without hitting anything over 15 or 20 yards. Right. So having those in there for our max V days has allowed us to kind of hit those postures early on in a safer environment. So I think that's really important. And then understanding, okay, now we can push it a little more. We can take the belts off. So you just have to kind of sprinkle it in and still slowly progress it, especially if they haven't done anything. So if they, sat on the couch, then you go in and max velocity sprint week 1, you're probably going to have some hamstrings.
Run into some issues there. Yeah. What kind of resistance do you use? Is it a 1080 or is it something else?
Yeah. So we don't have the budget for a 1080, but we use chains. So we'll have a belt around the waist and then a long cord, not an elastic cord, but just a long, I think it's Elite FTS or Spud Inc. Cord, and then chains on it. And kind of the decrement to that is, the friction is going to be an issue sometimes in the field turf. So if it's wet out, like we're kind of brainstorming, okay, it's not a perfect model, but it allows us to still get the adaptations we want, which is beneficial.
Do you guys use hills ever for resistance?
Yeah. So hills are like one of my favorite tools, but we don't have any hills. So we use heavy sleds. And I think one of the things that people and coaches kind of don't necessarily focus on is I want to hit the shapes that I'd hit using a hill, because the hill is going to be a natural deterrent in getting you in those shapes and positions and having the proper patterns. So I see coaches with like the long arms, and I don't really love that because so we'll always go arms to chest, and then we're always focusing on leg drive, obviously, but hitting the shapes and then just teaching those shapes. And then obviously the force development, there's a ton of research, but Matt Cross, JB Marin on heavy sleds. So we'll get double body weight on the sled. We'll go really heavy. It just depends on the time of year. But I think it's a tremendous teaching tool if used and coached properly.
Yeah, I think you're right. The hill is great and it's free if you have one. Otherwise you need these other options. But like you said, there's been a little bit of debate around those heavy sleds and do the alter mechanics. And I mean, we don't ask those questions when we talk about, the squatting alter, your sprinting mechanics or any of those. Same with, power speed drills. There could be an argument saying that, if you do too many of those, then your sprinting technique's is gonna go out the window. But I think we often forget that the athletes can handle multiple different tasks, and just because you do, you're going to run a certain way with a heavy sled doesn't mean that from now on all your VMAX work is going to be done with the exact same shapes, right?
Yeah, I think what you said, it really resonates, is that we don't have that same conversation with squats.
No.
So why are we having it with sleds? I can surf that force velocity curve, right? I can have it super light, right, and work a little more upright max V if it's 10% speed decrement or 5% speed decrement. But if I want double body weight on there, it's a strength dominant acceleration exercise. It's just more specific in that force vector. Yeah. So I think what you said there about, hey, we don't have that conversation with squat. Why are we having it with sleds? So I think that I've never heard that. I really like that.
What have been some of the most influential books or courses that you took as a strength and conditioning coach?
Anything by James Smith. So he's got, a couple applied sprint training, governing dynamics of coaching. Those two are phenomenal. Charlie Francis books are great. I think Vergashansky's work's awesome. So like, it's really those guys you always hear about. And I'll be the first to say, I did not fully understand each one when I was like, okay, like close the book, done. Like, let's go implement. It's like, no, I'm digging in that thing. I'm going 2 page forward, 1 page back. So it's definitely like discouraging sometimes when you're reading that stuff. And maybe that's just me. And some people are like, yo, that guy, I read it and I was good, but maybe that's just me. But I definitely think those guys you always hear about and are staples are really important. And then, so from a reading perspective, there's that, but conversations I learn, or at least to try to learn as much as I can from everybody I'm around. So, I learned some from this and from you already. I try and reach out to coaches every week to pick their brains about what they're implementing and what's actionable, because anybody can read the textbooks and the work, but if you're not actually implementing with the athletes and saying, okay, maybe altered this way or changed that, and this is how it benefited us, and this is what we saw that, maybe deterred our development a little bit. I think that's a little more important as well.
Now, I'll vouch for James Smith and Charlie Francis all day alongside you. I think those guys have been massively influential, especially in the whole speed game. Did you read Speed Trap by Charlie Francis?
I have not. I read the Key Concepts, so I've read that
Right.
book 3 times now. So it's kind of all of his works together, as well as the forums at the back. So you kind of
Okay.
have the Q&As after each section that focus on that specific section. So it allows you to have a lot of your questions answered already, which is pretty cool.
I wasn't actually familiar with that, so I'll have to look into it a little bit deeper. You mentioned something that you've put out that's called Sprint Tember, if I'm not butchering the name. Is that correct? Can you tell us more about
Yes.
it?
So if you're looking at, so it's just, all it is going to be a free sprint program, right? I'm
Cool.
going to put it out. It should be out by the time this airs, I believe.
Yeah.
The shirts are en route to my house right now. So
Nice.
it's similar to Squattober and Sorinex, right? It's
Yeah.
very similar to that, but
Okay.
I really wanted to bring something that focused on sprinting and popularized it, and instead of running, right? And I think that distinction is really important. So we can all learn together. We can all post times and do all that stuff. I think it'd be fun. So I'll have a free sprint program out. We'll be posting stuff on social media, but everybody can get their shirts. It'll be like just-sprint.com. And I'll have stuff on my social media for that. But yeah, we'll have shirts, and it'll just be a month of sprinting focused work in September, try and get faster. So I'll put out a free program that'll be hyperlinked, and we'll be able to all get faster together, and maybe just a little less in the squat rack dominant for the field. So I just kind of wanted to put something together. I think it'd be fun.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing. It's a great idea. I'll definitely link that in the show notes for people who are interested. Like you said, it will be available when the episode airs, so people can go in the description, click the link, and get access to that. Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Where can people find out more about you on social media in general if they want to follow you?
Yeah, my Instagram is TuckerMike43, and I've been starting to post a lot more frequently. I think I just got it like 6 months ago. So trying to get into the social media world, but one baby step at a time, but open to connecting and having conversations. Like, what's really come about that is, us connecting. I've connected with so many different coaches on there, and everybody's sharing ideas. So I've definitely gotten better. So since getting on social media. So definitely appreciate, everything that you're doing and connecting with you guys, and, anybody who wants to reach out, that's where they can find me.
Awesome. Well, for all the listeners and the viewers, go follow Mike on Instagram, connect with him. Mike, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to chatting with you soon.
Yeah, Sean, thanks for having me. Appreciate you.